What's up, good people of the world? Welcome to episode 3 of How to Write Like John Williams. So today we're going to be looking at the Quidditch theme. This particular excerpt using the Quidditch theme is from Harry's Wondrous World. I love this excerpt because it shows how he takes a little theme, and he develops it and builds up into this giant climax with the full brass section. Harmonizes it differently in the different little sections, and how he orchestrates it differently, and how he creates this really effective giant crescendo to the full theme with the full brass section, the Quidditch theme that we know and love. So as usual, first let's take a look at the thematic material at the piano. So in this excerpt, when the melody plays the first time, it's on the French horns in this key, and he has a little counter line going down beneath in the trombone. Now, I think counterlines like this are very, very interesting because, if you've taken two-part counterpoint, you'd look at this intervallically and say, okay, what do we have going here? We've got a major third, which is fine. We have contrary motion, which is nice. But, we have a minor seventh, which is a dissonance that needs to be resolved, but then it doesn't. It goes, right? So we get a minor third for a second, but then it goes to a minor seventh, which needs to be resolved, but then it doesn't really resolve. It just goes to an octave, a perfect consonance, which if you've taken two-part counterpoint, you know that's technically wrong. And then we land on this major ninth, or major second, you could call it, which is also a dissonance. So there's lots of dissonance. So if you look at this from a sheerly two-part counterpoint perspective, it's not good two-part counterpoint. But the important thing to realize is that this isn't two-part counterpoint. This is two counter lines that are interacting within a larger harmonic framework. So what we're missing is this nice, juicy A flat and C in the middle, which gives us harmonic context. So we don't think of these as dissonances, but we think of them as extensions to the chord. So if we look at the two bones that are right here and the bone that's going down in the counter line and with horns, if you look at it in context, it doesn't sound wrong anymore because we have harmonic context, right? We get an F minor 9 in first inversion, right? Then we get an F minor chord, which turns into an F minor 7. And then we get an A flat, add 6, right? In second inversion. And this constant respelling of A flat 6 and F minor 7, again, goes back to that whole ambiguity. So, when you are writing two-part counterpoint yourself, you need to ask yourself, is this truly naked two-part counterpoint by itself? And if it is, yes, you need to be very careful with the intervals and very careful with the harmonic implication, and you need to resolve dissonances if you want it to have a tonal sound. But if it's in the context of a larger harmonic framework, all you really need to be thinking about is the vertical sonority. Rather than are these notes dissonances with each other, think, are they congruent with the harmonic structure that I have set up for myself. And in this case they are, and that's why it sounds good in context. Okay? So, and he very often with this theme has a little imitative motion where he has, right, which works out very nicely. Because we have this, if we look at that from a canonical perspective, right, we have a fifth, and then a sixth, and then a dissonance, which then resolves. So, that imitation works out really nicely in that theme. And of course, the fact that the melody chills out for a second, chills out, and then da-da-da-da-da-da, he takes advantage of those holes and fills up that space. So that's how that section happens. And of course, he has other little textural things, which we'll look at later at the orchestration. But then he modulates to a new key, okay? And he has it in A Lydian, right? So a half step up. And the winds for contrast. With the horns underneath, he has this nice little thing. Right, which is nice. And again, if you look at this from a two-part counterpoint perspective, you see these and you're like, oh, it's parallel fifths. It's evil, right? But if we look at this in context, right, we have a fifth, which then turns into a, even though this is a fifth on the outside, the fact that we have this E inside of it gives it a suspended sound, right, which it basically cushions this unwanted parallel fifth sound and gives it a richer, warmer color, right? And it sort of disguises the parallel fifths. So again, you don't want to be dogmatic about these counterpoint rules. You just want to use them when you need to use them. The reason we avoid parallel fifths is because we may not like this sort of cold sound. But if you fill in other notes harmonically, you can take away that cold sound, you know. And he's kind of being consistent too, because the first time we have this theme, you know, the first time he does this little horn motive, it makes this nice parallel six, right? But then when the melody changes, he keeps the horn going and doing it the same to give it a sense of stasis, right, and to give it a sense of continuity. So the horn is continuing its line, but the melody is changing, but he keeps the horn line the same, which results in parallel fifths. But again, it's the continuity makes it sound good, and is what keeps our ear engaged, even though there are, you know, parallel fifths. So, and then he has a little string line, and here's another example of parallels that kind of come from a horizontal way of thinking rather than necessarily a vertical way of thinking, and they're totally fine. So he has this string line that goes right, which is just big. It's just a scale-wise string line that's moving down and leading into the next key center, right? So if we look at the way that this interacts with the melody, right, it starts out with really nice intervals, but in order to keep the line going, in order to just keep that scale-wise motion, sometimes it creates parallels with the upper melody. But it's okay because the independence of the string line sort of doing its scale-wise thing, and we expect it to move in scale-wise motion. Scale-wise motion is the most inevitable kind of motion. So we sort of forgive, again, you know, the parallel octaves in this case. I'll show you. So we start out with, you know, parallel sixths, right? And then an octave, which is a left and approach by contrary motion. So it starts out all checking out counterpoint rules. But then as we get down, you can see parallel fifths. See that right there? So again, you know, you might look at that and be like, you know, oh, it's bad counterpoint because it has parallel octaves. But context, you have to you realize why these rules were invented in the first place. And when you're doing more, creating more instrumental textural things like this, you know, sometimes keeping up the horizontal continuity of the line, like with the horns or with this, you know, scale-wise string motion, there's no need. In other words, there's no reason to change this scale-wise motion because it's so nice. If we tried to change the scale-wise motion, it would sound contrived, and we don't want to change the melody because it's the melody. So just let them work together, and you know, in parallel octaves, even though you could say, oh, we lose independence, maybe. They're still consonant. Octaves are consonant, right? So it's not like it's a messy sound. So again, in this case, you know, you can forego the rules of counterpoint in order to satisfy more important musical goals. And then he gets into this really interesting section over here. Which is kind of non-tonal in the sense that it doesn't really have a particular key, right? I think it's really interesting how the trumpet goes like this. So it kind of sounds like we're in D major here, right? Very clearly. But the trombone, right, is C major. And then interestingly enough, the strings are doing these septuplets or pentuplets, whatever you call them, down at the bottom. They're doing this. So we get this G major and C major and D major on top. And all of that gives it a sense of like, oh, where are we going to go? It gives it a sense of anticipation. And when he writes fanfare things like this, for not only for Harry Potter, but for Star Wars and for other films, he often gets into this kind of almost polytonal territory. It's not dissonant polytonality because they're all closely related chords and keys. But the disconnect between all these different chords are just build a sense of anticipation. So it goes like this. And these parallel fourths are really nice. Or not, I should say consecutive fourths. Because that's very ambiguous, totally. Starts out C, and then it could be G. Oh, no, but then it could be D. Right, so he's kind of encompassing all these different things. And that has a very... Right, that also is a classic sort of fanfare technique that you hear. And then he gives a little bit more interest in the trombone line. He goes, bum, 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 boom. And we get this really interesting dissonance. And he has this note right here, which is really interesting because this makes sense if we're in G Lydian, right? And it's sort of foreshadowing the fact that we're going to go into G Lydian. But then he uses C natural down here, and it's like, oh, okay, you know, maybe we're just in G normal major, you know, G Ionian. right? So we get a disconnect. And it's not direct chromaticism because the C sharp is up here and the C natural is down here. They're in different octaves, but, right? And then finally he gives us in the bones this big sort of dominant pedal, D, D, which leads really nicely into, of course, the key, you know. Right? And interestingly enough, he again uses C natural, so we kind of get this Ionian dominant feel, but then when we finally get into it, and it's actually Lydian instead of Ionian, he kind of sets it up to have a sense of brightness, right? So he kind of lowers the fourth scale degree, and then when we get to the new section, it has this Lydian brightness. So, you know, sometimes kind of changing the you know, mode to be slightly darker before you get to a particular place by contrast can make that seem brighter. So it's very nice. So of course, and then we get to the big really nice fanfare where we finally get the full version of the theme. And it really is just composed of, besides, you know, some harp runs and some woodwind tremolos, it really is just composed of just block chords, the melody, and then a nice horn counterline. And again, this is another great example of counterpoint that at a two-part counterpoint level doesn't seem like good counterpoint, but it works fantastically in context because of the horizontal continuity of the lines in combination with the harmonic richness of the rest of the parts. So, of course, the melody, and then we have this wonderful horn counterline. So that has melodic value in and of itself. And it's mostly scale-wise motion going down, right? So the fact that they're moving in separate directions, that contrary motion gives it a sense of, you know, real expansion and grandness, which is really nice. So, but again, if we look at this, right, you know, we look at the intervals, we got a third, a fifth. Okay, it's starting to get messy here. We've got a minor seventh, and then, you know, voice exchange, so that gives us a major second, and then we get fourths, parallel fourths, oh my goodness, and then, okay, we got a sixth. Right, and then it's fine counterpoint from there because we have an octave, we have a third, and then a fifth approached by contrary motion. And he just you know, repeats that little structure. So again, on a small basis, it sounds parallelly and is not particularly good. But if we fill in the rest of the harmonic, you know, we hear this not as being, you know, but which has so much more richness, right? So in the context, you know, the fact that this is a really nice horizontal line and this is a really nice horizontal line, that's what makes them work. Not that they work contrapuntally on top of each other from an intervallic perspective, because you only really have to consider intervals when you're implying harmony without any other harmony, right? So in context, this sounds like this. So much better, right? So, you know, again, to drive that point home, when you take counterpoint, when you learn all the rules of counterpoint, you need to know when and when not to follow those rules, and you know, just be aware of why those rules were created, and then you can intelligently break them, not for the sake of breaking them, and not for the sake of ignorance. You should be aware of the rules, but in certain cases, horizontal continuity of melodic line is more important than trying to follow the rules of counterpoint for independence. And if you have a broader harmonic context, you don't need to imply harmony so clearly just with two lines, because you have more than just two lines, even though those are the only two contrapuntal lines, if that makes sense. Anyway, and then finally, just to sort of drive the point home, he has, you know, this nice little woodwind thing. So this little is a nice little color stick device. It starts out with just like a trill, and he uses a nice little kind of you know, sub-leading tone chromatic. So even though that doesn't really belong you know, in the key, it's just sort of a half-step kind of neighbor tone, and then it gives it a sense of whimsicalness, you know, kind of a playfulness to it, and then just works really nicely intervallically with the melody. Right, we get a minor sixth, a minor third, and another minor sixth. Right, so we can see, you know, again, you know, all of these devices work really nicely, and it's really never more than 2 or 3 ideas going on. But yeah, let's see how he orchestrates it.
All right, so before we get started, let's go ahead and see how Note Performer handles this. It's funny, there's a last minute modulation, so it's like, I wanted to keep going. But that's the excerpt we're looking at today. So one little thing I just want to qualify is that some things I've notated a little bit differently just so that they play back correctly. For example, the timpani and the cymbal and the tambourine and the harp glissandi. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how they're properly notated. So as you can see, he uses a little X note head here for the tambourine and for the piatti. So, you know, piatti is synonymous with cymbal. I believe it's the Italian word for cymbal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he likes to write piatti. And same thing with bass drum. He likes to write grand cassa instead of bass drum, which is synonymous with bass drum. But anyway, and then he writes a little let ring. You can see that the note is tied to nothing. I think I addressed that in another video. But if you tie a note to a rest and you sort of shorten the length of the tie, so that it only lasts about the value of one note, it basically means to just let it ring out and don't stop the sound from happening. And then as you can see, the way that he writes the harp glissandi, and the way that you're supposed to write harp glissandi, is to write basically the first note and then the approximate note value. So in this case, it's the 64th note, and then the ending note. And then, of course, the harpist can just set their pedals based on what the key of the piece is, and then just sort of move their hand up the harp. You could think of it as like, fitting like 73 notes inside of one beat or something, but it's much easier to just write it out like this, and much easier for the harpist to read it. You're going to get the same effect rather than writing out some giant tuplet. You know what I mean? So whereas what I did in this score in Sibelius is I just notated it out in the harp and then just hit it. So I notated all the notes out just so that it would play back properly. But just for your information, that's how you're supposed to notate harp runs. So anyway, returning to the score, let's go ahead and check out the first section. So the melody is on 4 horns, right? And again, his little articulations here are really nice. And I think it's interesting how several times throughout the score, even when he has a repeated motive, he'll slightly change the articulation. So as you can see, he has this motive right here without staccato markings, ba-da-da-dum-dum-dum, and then he gives them staccato markings the second time, ba-ba-ba-bum-bum-bum. This keeps the repetition from being annoying or boring, by slightly changing it up. And so, his articulation markings are always really nice. So just the melody by itself on horn sounds like this. Really nice. And then we have this little counter line, which he basically just gives to the flutes, and then the oboe is down in octaves. So the flute's up in their higher register, and then the oboe is sort of up in their relative higher register. Is going to give a really nice blend because, the oboe has nice resonance in that area, and the flute has nice resonance. So they're gonna be very nice and comparable dynamically. And the fact that they're different in frequency range means that they're going to pop out. You'll notice their mezzo piano and the horns are forte, even though the horns are a brass instrument. He wants the woodwind to not distract from the melody and to just, sort of be boop, 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 and just kind of follow in the background. So if we play just the horns and the woodwinds by themselves, it sounds like this. Right, so you can definitely hear them, but they don't distract from the melody. It's just a nice little airy sort of complement, and it fills up this rhythmic space. He's very good at complementarily, if that's a word, filling up rhythmic space with his accompaniments. Okay, so and then we get this nice little chocolatey trombone chords, mezzo piano, so again they don't get in the way, and everything is in its own spectrum. The horn is up in its sort of upper mid tenor range, the woodwinds are up high, not conflicting with it, the trombones are down here playing this nice low mid, this pad, and then of course we have the the bass line that comes in, and but it's a very, very light sound. He doesn't have a low bass note in this particular first section. It's a very light and airy sound, so that when the bass does come in, it has impact. But anyway, of course, we just have this simple A flat, kind of major third in combination with the descending counterline we talked about. Right, so just that in the horn sounds like this. And again, that contrary motion is really nice. And then that with the woodwinds sounds like this. And then finally, he adds a really nice little textural warmth with the strings. And this is usually what he does. You know, either these strings are... the strings are excellent blenders, right? So either the strings are sort of doing their own thing and then everybody else kind of strengthens the strings and the strings are showcased. Or you have the woodwinds or brass being featured and then the strings sort of, you know, play a more complementary role, which is what they're doing here, which is really nice. So he takes the bum 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 da 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 dum bum bum and he emphasizes that with pizzicato. Right, and pizzicato is pretty quiet, so he does a really nice thing. Instead of having just one section, like just the first violins playing pizzicato, and then putting them up to forte, where they might have to pluck really hard and it might give a nasty, because the harder you pluck a string, the more it sounds like Bartok pits, where you pick up the note and let it slap against the fingerboard, it gets a more percussive sound, but he likes the resonance. So rather than doing that, rather than pushing one of them at forte, he just has, you know, the seconds and the first. He just has more players playing, but just gives them mezzo forte, so it's this nice, you know... And, you know, and it adds a really nice but very subtle little push to that sound. So we'll go ahead and listen to what the horns in combination with that little pizzicato emphasis sounds like. Right, so it's very nice, very nice. And then he also, interestingly, takes the this little counterline da 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 da, and doubles it with the viola, which is very nice. You know, very nice blending place for the viola. Right, which sounds like this with a trombone. And I like how he just starts out with the trombone, and then the viola comes in and adds this extra level of, you know, and then he also takes this bum boom and emphasizes that with cello pits, right? And of course, the lower instruments have, you know, the lower string instruments, their pits is very resonant. So a player might have a tendency to not let a note ring out. You know, if the harmony is changing, like if you write a dotted quarter, they're going to play it and then sort of mute it so it doesn't ring out because you might not want it to ring out. So in this case, Williams qualifies, and that should be a little bit bigger, but I'll go ahead and put a screenshot of what the actual score is. But you can see he writes a little wet ring symbol for the lower pits, and he tends to do that for the cello and for the bass, you know, because he wants that to ring out. Okay, and then we have this nice little bass line, which just sort of leads us into the new section. Boom. Which, and I think the nice thing about this is that it feels like the bass is making us feel like we're going downward, but in reality the harmony is going upward, right? We're going from A flat Lydian to A Lydian, so we're going up, but the bass line moving in contrary motion again gives that sense of expansion, which is really nice. So that's pretty much it. And then the only other thing is that, you know, the bones have this nice little break here. You know, again, we're hearing this dum bum 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 bum. We're hearing it over and over again. So he adds a nice little change, and bum 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 gives it a little staccato, a break, and then they come back in. Right, and it also gives a sense of suspense leading into the next section. Okay, so and then the woodwinds. You know, of course, both of the bassoons are doubling what the cello is doing for that little low bass note, and then he is using a sort of transitional device here. So as you can see, you know, when we get to the point where the woodwinds are playing the melody in the next section, he has a different combination. He has the flute in a lower register and the clarinets doubling the flute, so it's a clarinet-centric sound because the clarinet is going to have more power in that register than the flute, but it's still the flute still has resonance in that register, but it's flute. The flute is reinforcing the clarinet rather than before where the oboes were reinforcing the flute. So in this case, that sounds like this. Right, and that's a really nice sound. Flute and clarinet double each other very well. But he also still keeps the oboes and the English horns just for this little push. So it kind of seems to do sections together. Rather than having this counter line and then a totally new thing, he has them all together for a second, and it makes it a seamless transition. Okay, so all of that sounds like this. So, and he takes this nice little, you know, clarinet and flute doubling, and he gives it a little bit of shimmer with the Glock, and again, he puts them down a dynamic level, yeah, a mezzo forte. usually a good idea because the Glock is pretty piercing. And sometimes you might want to, with the Glock, it's common to use just to accent certain notes. Like, for example, if you remember that moment from E.T., it was like, you know, and I'll play a version, a sampled version of that. But yeah, notice how the Glock doesn't play on every single note. It just adds little accents here and there because too much Glock and it can get really resonant. But up in this register, and the fact that the melody spans a short span, and if you play all the notes of the melody together, it doesn't make a harmonically bad dissonance. He just uses them for all of the notes here. So, and then the only other thing that we have in combination with, the melody is this descending string line that we talked about, remember with the parallels, and he uses nice dovetailing here. I remember the first time I ever heard of this technique of dovetailing was in Beethoven's 7th Symphony. If you remember that, there's a moment where it goes, bum, 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 bum. Oh, I'll just go ahead and play it. So yeah, that's like the classic dovetailing example. But anyway, it's a really nice, just sort of coloristic thing that doesn't really distract. And you'll notice again he puts them all at mezzo piano, so they're not distracting. Right, and again these little additions of these little things. So he puts them mainly on détaché where they're bowing everything. So it has a sense of like, it's not particularly smooth. But then he throws in a little slur every now and then. Beep, beep. Right, which is really, really nice, and he makes it even more apparent in the cello with a slur onto a staccato. Ba, ba. Right, again, little details like this just make all the difference. Really nice. And then the only other thing, well, first I'll go ahead and play what that sounds like with the melody. Then we got the Glock, we've got our 2 clarinets, and we've got our 2 flutes. That sounds like this. Right, really nice, because the melody seems to have upward motion, and the string line seems to have downward motion. So again, contrary motion is thebomb.com. And again, he changes the articulation here. Right, before it was just either détaché or staccato, but now he adds this little It adds a nice variety, which is really nice. And then the only other thing that he has is, of course, just 2 horns, mezzo forte. He doesn't use all the horns, but just 2 of them, filling in the harmonic kind of background. One of them on a pedal tone. Kind of giving a suspended chord kind of sonority. That in combination with the melody, it's really just juicing up the melody harmonically because it has the same exact rhythm as the melody. And notice how he drops out the horn. He has the horns come in on the first note, but then he lets them drop out so that can take control of our ears and we can hear that. Whereas if he just sort of started and immediately had the horns rhythmically doubling the melody, the horns might distract. So that's kind of a fugal technique where you have this melody enter and then the counter melody enters, and because your attention is already on the top melody, the counter melody doesn't have enough strength to vie away your attention, right? It's whatever takes your attention first, then your attention is sort of magnetized to that. And then when you want your attention to move to something else, it takes a lot more effort, if that makes sense. So anyway, that all sounds like this. And then we have this nice, lovely little brass section here. So he has all 3 trumpets playing their little thing. Which is really nice, and as you can see, it's really a development of the melody, right? Boom, 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 right? Boom, 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 boom. But he goes back down. He's kind of leading up to it. He's like, "Are we gonna get there? Are we gonna get there?" Dun 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 boom, and then he kind of takes that bum 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 and kind of does a little thing, and he does these types of things a lot. By the way, whenever he's creating noodling material, if that makes sense, or developmental, where you kind of have like not really the main theme, but kind of in between stuff, he often has little these types. It's kind of a John Williams style thing, where he has a third and then a fourth and then a fifth. So we're at where it's building. It has a sense of building because the intervals are getting bigger and bigger, jumping up and down and up and down. He does that in a lot of his scores, so that's a really nice sound. And notice how he has subito mezzo forte. He wants them to feel like they're building up, but then they kind of go back down. So it's interesting. You don't see subito mezzo forte very often. Subito means suddenly, by the way, if you weren't aware. So suddenly mezzo forte. So he doesn't want it to be gradual. He wants it to be bum 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 dum dum bum bum dum dum bum 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 bum. So and then we have these nice little trombones. And again, he doesn't, you know, he always dovetails. He seams things together, right? This new section technically starts right here with the 9/8, but he has the trumpets begin where the old one ends. You know, they happen on top of each other so that it has this constant sense of flow and motion that's really nice, rather than just have, okay, section, okay, new section, new section, new section, and just being very blocky. So, and he uses this fugal technique here of dropping out a voice. You notice he has the bones come in with this bum, but then he has the trumpets bum, but then the bones come in later bum. So it draws attention to the bones. It's a very contrapuntal thing. It's a nice technique, and also notice how he makes the rhythm of the bones and the trumpets very complementary to each other. Right? Whenever he has duplets in the trumpets, he has triplets and the bones, and vice versa, right? And then when he has a moment like this where they're together, bum 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 bum, you know, he has this, you know, oblique motion, which is really nice. And then he maintains this note with the trumpet, but then this G changes to a C, right? So again, you know, if use oblique or contrary motion if they have the same rhythm, but if they have different rhythms, then, you know, it's okay to have, you know, similar motion. So you can see right here, you know, this G is moving up to C, and this is it transposing score? So that would be this D moving up to an E. They're moving in the same direction, but the rhythm keeps it separate. So it's just kind of a contrapuntal thing. But the trombones by themselves sound like this. Right, really nice. Which in combination sounds like this. And again, like I talked about, we get this big, nice pedal, bum, bum, which leads, it's like a big, giant, dominant kind of sound, which leads really well into the next section, okay? A nice little a bit of richness and color that he adds, you know, the oboe and the clarinet down in this direction, down in this register, right? The oboe down here and the clarinet down here both have a very rich sound because, you know, obviously the low register of double reeds is very reedy and loud and rich. And then the low register of the clarinet, the chameau register, is very rich. So they can compete with the brass, and it blends well. Right, you can hear it almost has a brassy sort of quality to it. So this, again, it's a very subtle little touch, but in combination with bones, it just gives it a little push. It just gives it a sense of that. But he only just has it for one measure, and then the brass sort of take over. And then the last thing that he has pits leading into the next section, bump bum, right, which is really nice. And then he has, interestingly enough, this kind of bloom, right, bloom. And I think the fact that he has a pentuplet here, or whatever you want to call this, 5-tuplet is usually just what I hear people call it. This kind of goes back to my Let's Write Music series, where I was talking about if you want to give a sense of like a texture rather than specific notes, choose a really like a prime number that you know, like 7 or 5 or 11, something that just doesn't at all line up with your time signature, right? So this sense of 1 2 3 4 5 1, 1 2 3 4 5 1, gives it a sense of gives it a sense of suspense, right? And again, he wants to give it a richer sound without it distracting from the brass. So rather than having like just cellos and just second violins playing it, but then putting it to like mezzo forte, he has them all play it for a rich sound, but then he just lowers the dynamic to mezzo piano. So this gives a sense of anticipation, right? Which in combination with the little brass fanfare stuff, sounds like this. Right, really nice, really nice. So that little section, those are all the components of that section. That sounds like this. All right. So, and now let's look at this little transitional thing here. And again, like I said, I really like how he, if we turn off transposing score here, how he uses the C natural, right? He thinks it makes it sound like G major. So then when he raises it to C, it has such a bright sound to it, which is very, very nice. But let's see, what else do we have here? I feel like there's something else. Oh yeah, he takes this little he takes this the string thing, right, and turns it into a kind of along with the dominant pedal, which is what he plays there, and he adds a little dominant with the Pitts bass, right, and you can see there's a string. I should probably unhide this because, you know, I was originally gonna make it like one of those things where it is notated correctly, but it doesn't show up right. Couldn't figure out how to make the spacing work. But anyway, but this is approximately, I'll go ahead and show the score. You can see he kind of approximately gives a sense of the contour of the line and sort of lets the harpist kind of make it up ad lib, right? So I just kind of did the same thing with this, but again, it's a very common transitional device to use the harp in this context. And of course we have, you know, timpani and suspended cymbal. And I like how he waits. He doesn't have the timpani come in on the downbeat. He has bum 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 bum. Same thing with all of the bass, which we'll look at in a second. But first off, we have of course the melody, which is just in one trumpet. And then the trombone starts off kind of doing its own little thing, and then goes into doubling the melody. But that sounds like this. Right, but that's all that have the melody, right? You know, so it definitely pops out in real life, even though there are only two instruments that have the melody on top of this, you know, giant tutti that we've got going here. And then we, of course, have the horn counterline we talked about. And then the rest of the brass instruments, the lower two trumpets and the lower bone, are just playing, you know, those chord tones. You know, just moving and changing inversion with the contour of the melody. So all the brass sounds like this. So again, he leaves out the bass section and brings it back in for emphasis. And you'll notice he adds this little bum bum, this nice dominant tonic, you know, this nice fifth, which gives it a rich sound that really, like, okay, this is G Lydian. It really cements that home. And again, the duplet on top of triplet makes it very complementary. And he has this in bassoons, you know, bassoon 1 and 2, and then down an octave with the contrabassoon. He has it with the timpani, and he has it, of course, with the cello and the bass, Arco. It sounds like this. And again, he doesn't overuse the timpani. He just uses the timpani for the first push, and then, you know, and then he drops it out and then saves the timpani for later. You don't want to overuse accent percussion, which I'm definitely guilty of that. So that sounds like this. So, and he does this a lot. Like in Anakin's theme is a great example. If you go and listen to Anakin's theme from The Phantom Menace, he has these rich, higher, sort of like drops out the contrabass with like cello in the higher register, these rich string things that are just really delicious. And then he brings in the contrabass for a specific moment and then drops them out again. You know, he's very good at, you know, doing that. So don't necessarily think like you have to have a deep bass line going 100% of the time. Sometimes it has more impact if you drop it out and then bring it back in. So, and then of course he has these nice little, right? And the reason that he writes down bow is because of the fact that it's on an offbeat. They might play it with an up bow instead of a down bow. So he just specifies that it should be a down bow. So it's a nice little, you know, sort of, he's basically just sort of writing, he has little trills on the major 7th and on the add 6, or you could think of it as 13. So it's just sort of like, you know, it's like, you know, G, A, B, D, E, and F sharp. So you're getting the calmest, the warmest extensions. The add 9 or add 2, and then the, you know, the add 6, and then the major 7. And then he just trolls between them. That type of a thing. And that's a technique that he does all the time. You know, you never get a dissonant sound when you just use those particular intervals. And interestingly enough, he also has the Glock doing that particular thing. which has a really nice sound. And then if he has the upper woodwinds, and notice how the third oboe plays English horn, so it starts out playing English horn, and then he says two oboe, right? Because the third, if you, winds and twos, it'd be the second player, but with winds and threes or winds and fours, it'd be you have doubling players, so they you know, like the third oboe player plays oboe and plays English horn, so you could have them set down the English horn and pick up oboe and switch back and forth. And of course, that's filling in the space for the melody, ba-ba-ba-bum, right? It's filling in the empty space. Right, and then he has a little complementary color going on for the first half, because right there everything is happening happening in the later half of the measure. So for the first half of the measure, he has this really nice little tambourine thing that he uses here. Very nice, which definitely reminds me of the Pines of Rome. And then, of course, we have the harp with these little runs, which is sort of, to a certain extent, rhythmically doubling the idea of the tambourine. So all of that together sounds like this. Of course, those trills sound a lot better in real life, so we'll listen to that real quick. Yeah, really nice. And then he has, has the woodwinds do a little run leading into the next area, the next section, where we get a new key center. Okay, and the harp should be playing that as well. So now the melody exists in the viola. He has it in the lower register of the Glock, so it gives it a sense of change. He has it in the lower register of the trumpet in combination with the upper register of the horns, right? And I can't remember whether or not I've talked about this before, but this is something that Williams does a lot. And it really, adding one trumpet underneath four horns really adds an extra buzz and quality to the sound, because the trumpet in the lower register still has a lot of power down there, as long as they're not pushed like too far below the staff, down to like F, I would say, concert pitch F, below middle C. They can play very comfortably down there, and they add a lot of bite to the sound, but because it's just one trumpet, it doesn't distract from the horns at all. So I'll just play the horns and the trumpet by itself and hear what that sounds like. So you can really hear that adds a lot of bite. If we just play the horn by itself, right, it's a much nobler sound. The horn adds a lot of bite. And then the bones are doing something very similar to what they did at the beginning. With a nice little bum, boom, bum, with a little bit of a bass trombone motion, but they're basically just, harmonically accenting what's the melody on top. And notice how he still only has the bones at mezzo piano. He doesn't want to give them a chance to be too loud, because the bones can definitely pop out. You can see that is a good volume for them, and then so taking that in combination with the percussion and of course the viola, which sounds great in that register. Really nice. And doubling viola and cello and horn in that register is just a great sound. If you remember Jupiter from the Planets, this particular section uses that, and it's great. Yeah, just, so rich. And I also love how he adds these little words here, like bravura, so with a sense of bravado. He just a little word, like that lets them know that they can just add a little extra level of rhythmic and emotional and subtle detail to their playing, and make it sound like it has a sense of vibrato. You don't have to go overboard, but just little words like this can make all the difference from your players. Like right here, he writes joyously. And maybe it'll make the players smile. I don't know if that messes up your embouchure, but it can really help. It can really help the player know what kind of mood you're going for here. You know, you don't always have to just put it in the tempo marking, because usually they're not looking up there. The conductor is looking up there. So anyway, and then he does the little, you know, the wind counter line, but of course now he does it with all of the winds so that they have a chance to compete. Right. And then he has this really nice bass line, which starts off with this descending motion, which is similar to the string line we had, like, which is really nice. But then it turns into a really nice, rhythmically complementary thing. And this thing right here is he's borrowing material from the horns. You remember the horns were going bum 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 bum. So he has this right here. You remember the horns went back and forth between A and E and B and E. So he's sort of taking that harmonic idea because it works well and turning it into a bass line. And this yada is a really nice, you know, sort of scale-wise motion that leads down. So it just makes a really nice, bass line. And as usual, it's bassoons doubled with cello. And then he has pizzicato bass. Boom, 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 boom. Just doubling those first two notes to give a sense of emphasis. Right. So, you know, again, you really can't go wrong with scales. And if you want a great example of really effective scales, listen to Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. Lots of great scale stuff in that. That's pretty much it. Yeah, we got the bass line, we got the little counter line that fills up the space, we've got the melody, we've got the horn chords, we've got a cymbal and a bass drum hit, you know, pretty standard stuff. And then we also have strings doing the little thing, just to add an extra level of color. There you go. All right, so so that's this excerpt. You know, it's really nicely orchestrated, very clean, and again, he gets a lot of variety, you know, out of this little motive. He repeats it over and over again, so it gets stuck in your head, but it never gets boring because he always changes something. But at the same time, he reuses material that he knows works well. You know, he'll take if he has this descending scale-wise counterline and it works well, he'll reuse it, but he'll put it in the bass, so it doesn't sound like he's recycling old material. So you keep a sense of consistency and continuity while also giving textural variety, so that there's a sense of emotional progression. So with that, let's go ahead and one last time listen to the final version.